There are photographs that freeze joy, some that preserve triumph, and others that capture the warmth of life in motion. But then there are the photographs no one speaks of, the ones taken in cold rooms, in houses where the curtains are drawn, and where the silence feels too heavy to breathe. These are the final images, the last attempt to hold on to someone who has already slipped from the world. And among them lies the most haunting kind of portrait, the smile placed upon a face that will never smile again. Before we descend into this unsettling chapter of history, welcome to the story. If you enjoy dark historical narratives and want to explore the shadows of our past with me, please consider subscribing. It helps keep these forgotten stories alive. At the end of this introduction, I ask, gently, subscribe if you like. The story of death photography begins here, in a world unprepared for the fragile nature of life, where disease claimed children before their first birthday and adults vanished with the suddenness of a candle blown out. The earliest practitioners of photography did not imagine they would become custodians of final memories, yet the demand came swiftly and relentlessly. Families who had never been photographed in life were photographed in death, their stillness held in glass and metal, their features frozen as the last proof that they once walked upon the earth. The idea seems strange now, but to the people of the 19th century, it was not morbid. It was love. Love expressed in the only permanent form they had. In a quiet rural town, where winters lingered too long and life was measured in seasons of harvests and sickness, a young photographer named Elias Hart traveled with his wooden camera and a horse-drawn cart filled with fragile equipment. He had learned the trade in a bustling city, where portraits were taken for weddings, grand openings, and proud family gatherings. But in the countryside, the requests were different. People called for him not when a child learned to walk, but when that child no longer could. Families waited with trembling hands and reddened eyes, hoping he could do something impossible, lend a sense of peace to a face touched by death. The first time Elias received such a request, he felt unprepared. He arrived at a small farmhouse where a single oil lamp flickered in the window. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs and grief. A mother sat near a small cradle, her fingers gently stroking a blanket that no longer warmed a living child. A father stood behind her, stiff and pale, as though he himself had forgotten how to breathe. The child they had lost was a girl barely 2 years old. She had hair soft as silk and cheeks that still held the faintest echo of life. She looked as though she might wake up at any moment, and perhaps that illusion was what her parents needed most. Elias set his equipment carefully on a table. The long exposure process was slow and unforgiving, requiring absolute stillness. For a living subject, this meant patience. For the dead, it meant an eerie advantage. Yet it was not the technical aspect that troubled him. It was the weight of responsibility. He would become the caretaker of her final image, the last imprint of her existence. In this farmhouse, where sorrow clung to the walls, he realized his work was not merely mechanical, it was sacred.
The preparation began quietly. The mother smoothed the child's hair, while the father fetched the small blue dress she had worn on her birthday. They dressed her with tenderness, adjusting ribbons and arranging the soft curls around her face. Elias watched their hands, steady despite the tremors of grief. These rituals were performed with reverence, as though each movement whispered a farewell. Death had not stolen their urge to care for her, it had sharpened it. Elias lifted the child gently, noting the coolness of her skin and the unnatural heaviness of her limbs. He placed her on a small chair designed for such portraits, its back fitted with a discreet metal support to hold her upright. Her posture, once a sign of lively mischief, had to be crafted now. He adjusted her hands so they rested softly on her lap. He angled her head with delicate precision, ensuring her expression resembled peaceful slumber rather than final stillness. The parents requested one thing more, a faint smile. Not a broad grin, not an expression of cheer, but a subtle lift that suggested contentment. Elias hesitated. He had heard of photographers doing this, though it was rare and difficult. It required a gentle touch, an understanding of shadows and angles. A too obvious manipulation could turn the image grotesque. He studied the child's delicate features. She had a softness that might lend itself to the illusion. The lighting was adjusted first, positioned near the window where winter sunlight filtered through frost. Natural light helped mask the stillness of death, illuminating the face with warmth that seemed almost alive. Elias tilted her chin slightly, allowing shadows to fall in a way that suggested a serene expression. Then, using a tiny wooden tool, he raised the corners of her lips just enough that they hinted at a smile. It was not joy. Joy belonged to the living, but a quiet peace. It was the kind of smile one might have while sleeping, dreaming of safety. When Elias stepped back, he felt a prickle at the base of his neck. The child looked alive. The illusion was delicate, but it held. Her parents approached slowly, their breath catching at the sight. Their grief did not fade, but something softened. The image before them was not death. It was the memory of their daughter as she had been on better days. They nodded silently, giving Elias permission to begin. He took a breath, steadied his hands, and prepared the plate. The exposure would take time. The room had to remain absolutely still. Even the flicker of the lamp was too much movement, so he extinguished it. The winter daylight became their only illumination. The family stood behind him, holding each other in the dimness. Elias uncovered the lens, and the long seconds stretched into an eternity. During that motionless span, he felt the strange atmosphere of the room closing in around him. Time seemed suspended. Outside, a breeze stirred the snow against the window, but inside, everything was locked in an unnatural calm. Elias felt the weight of the moment, the way grief and hope intertwined. It struck him that these photographs were not merely records of death. They were anchors for the living, something to cling to when memories grew dim.
The exposure ended, and Elias covered the lens. The hardest part was done, but the image was still fragile and unseen. He moved to his portable darkroom, a small wooden box with a black curtain. Inside, his hands worked carefully with chemicals that smelled sharp and bitter. As the image revealed itself, the faint smile appeared first, emerging like a ghost from the shadows. Then the eyes, half-lidded in eternal rest. Then the features of a child who had been loved fiercely and would be remembered fiercely. When he brought the finished plate to the parents, the mother pressed her hands to her mouth, unable to speak. The father stood rigid, tears rolling down his cheeks unrestrained. They did not thank Elias, not because they were ungrateful, but because gratitude felt too small for what he had given them. In that photograph, their daughter existed again, if only as a fragile illusion on metal and silver. Elias packed his equipment and stepped outside into the cold air. The sky was a pale gray, and the world felt numb and hushed. He had taken many photographs before, but none had affected him like this. He realized then that death photography was more than capturing the dead. It was helping the living find a way to carry on. As he rode away, he wondered how many more families would call on him, how many more final smiles he would be asked to create. In the quiet of the road, he felt the weight of each life he had preserved, each sorrow he had witnessed. And somewhere deep within, he knew this was only the beginning. The world was changing, and until death loosened its grip on households, his work would remain essential. In the years ahead, Elias would revisit that memory often, the first time he crafted a smile for someone who would never smile again. It marked the moment he understood the strange power of his craft.
He had entered a profession that stood between life and death, offering a last, lingering touch of humanity to those who felt its absence most acutely. And as he continued his journey from town to town, his camera becoming a vessel for final farewells, he accepted the strange truth of his new role. He was not merely a photographer. He was a guardian of memory, a witness to loss, and a quiet architect of the images families clung to long after the world had taken everything else from them. There are houses where grief settles so heavily that even the walls seem to bow under its weight. When you step inside, something in the air changes. Sounds grow muted, colors fade, and time slows until every second feels like it has been stretched thin. These are the rooms where death has arrived recently, the rooms where a body rests in patient stillness while the living try to comprehend the sudden emptiness. In towns where death visited often and stayed too long, the home became the first stage of mourning. Long before funeral parlors existed, the dead were tended to where they had lived, on the same beds where they had slept, in the same rooms where they laughed, wept, and dreamed. These rooms were transformed through a ritual both practical and emotional. Curtains were drawn to soften harsh sunlight. Clocks were stopped to mark the moment life ended. Mirrors were covered to prevent reflections from trapping the soul, according to old beliefs whispered through generations. The living walked carefully, as though afraid their footsteps might disturb the silence clinging to the space.
For photographers like Elias Hart, these rooms became familiar. He entered them not as a friend nor as a stranger, but as someone who moved between the living and the dead with a quiet purpose. On a cold evening, he was summoned to a large house on the edge of a forest, where a family waited to prepare their deceased mother for her final photograph. She had been the heart of the household, a woman whose laughter filled the kitchen each morning and whose hands had shaped countless meals and memories. Her death was sudden, and the grief in that household lingered like thick smoke. When Elias arrived, the oldest daughter greeted him with a lantern. Her face was drawn, her eyes swollen, and yet she maintained a posture of responsibility. Grief had forced her into an early adulthood. She led him through the narrow hallway toward a bedroom lit by a single candle. Inside, the atmosphere was dense with sorrow. Sisters stood near the bed, whispering instructions to one another as they worked, while younger siblings clung to each other in the corner, uncertain whether to be afraid, devastated, or both. The deceased woman lay on the bed, her hands folded neatly, her expressions softened by death. The family had washed her carefully, combing her hair back and dressing her in a simple gown she loved. They placed a small locket around her neck, a sentimental piece containing the portrait of her late husband. These tasks were performed with slow precision. They were not for the photographer, they were for themselves. Preparing her body was the final act of love they could offer, the last time their hands would touch her with tenderness. Elias watched with quiet respect as the daughters arranged embroidered pillows behind her shoulders, lifting her gently to create a posture that suggested peaceful rest. The oldest brought a small bouquet of winter flowers, placing them near her mother's hands. The petals were frost-kissed, fragile reminders of beauty in a season that rarely offered any. This combination of ritual and familiarity created a space where grief could breathe without breaking, where each motion served to preserve dignity. He set up his equipment at the foot of the bed, unfolding the tripod and adjusting the camera's angles. The room was dim, and he had to choose his lighting carefully. Too much illumination would reveal the pallor of death. Too little would obscure the gentle expression on her face. He moved the candle closer, allowing its warm glow to soften the harshness that sometimes accompanied stillness. The daughters continued their preparations, brushing stray hairs from her mother's forehead and smoothing the fabric of the gown. Their movements were slow, almost ceremonial. Each gesture carried the weight of finality. In their silence, Elias could sense the unspoken memories that drifted between them. The meals their mother cooked, the stories she told, the songs she hummed while washing clothes by the river. These memories rose and fell like tides, shaping the emotional landscape of the room.
For the family, this photograph would not simply be an image. It would be the last moment they would share with her. It was a way to refuse the swift erasure that death often brings. In homes like these, where photographs were scarce and portraits even rarer, the dead sometimes received the only formal image they would ever have. It was strange, perhaps even unsettling, but it was a reflection of the era's realities. Life was uncertain, fragile, and often brutally short. As Elias adjusted his camera again, he became aware of the room's peculiar stillness. It was not the calm of a quiet house, nor the peace of a tranquil morning. It was the heavy silence of absence. He had witnessed this silence many times, yet each room carried its own unique echo. In some homes, the air felt thick with sorrow. In others, there was a strange acceptance, as though death was a familiar visitor rather than an unexpected intruder. This particular room held a mixture of both. The children's presence introduced a poignant innocence, a confusion that neither words nor rituals could quiet. The older daughters, on the other hand, bore their grief like a quiet burden. Each breath seemed deliberate, each movement a reminder of the responsibility laid upon them. Elias knew that his work would carry immense emotional weight for them. The photograph would become an anchor they clung to when memories grew blurred and voices faded from recollection. With the preparations complete, the daughters stepped back, allowing Elias space to work. He approached the bed, observing the delicate way the candle's glow kissed the contours of the woman's face. Her features were softened, not by life, but by the gentle stillness of death. He adjusted her posture slightly, lifting her chin by a fraction and repositioning her hands to rest more naturally on the bouquet. The youngest daughter inhaled sharply at the sight, perhaps surprised at how subtly these changes transformed her appearance. Once everything was arranged, Elias uncovered the lens. The exposure time was long, requiring the room to remain motionless. The children hesitated, then stood perfectly still, as though frozen by the solemnity of the moment. The flickering candle cast subtle shadows on the walls, but its flame remained unwavering. For these long seconds, the room became a suspended world, a place where death and memory intertwined. When the exposure ended, Elias moved to his darkroom box and began developing the plate. The sharp smell of chemicals filled the air as shapes slowly emerged. The woman's face appeared first, serene and softened by shadows. Then the bouquet, resting gently upon her hands. Finally, the surrounding details took form, revealing the room where love and grief had blended into one silent ritual. When Elias presented the photograph to the daughters, the oldest covered her mouth to suppress a sob. The image was beautiful in its own mournful way. It captured not only the woman's stillness, but also the care the family had poured into her final moments. The younger children studied the image with wide eyes, unsure whether to feel comforted or unsettled. The daughters, however, understood its significance immediately. It was a fragile echo of the mother they had known, a last chance to hold her in the presence of the living.
As Elias packed his equipment, he glanced around the room one last time. Though the photograph now existed, the silence remained heavy. It would linger for days, perhaps weeks, until life slowly seeped back into the household. Yet the ritual of preparation, the careful arranging of the room and the creation of the final image would remain embedded in the family's memory forever. Outside, the evening had deepened into night. A soft wind rustled the trees, carrying the scent of pine through the air. Elias stood for a moment, absorbing the quiet of the forest. He had witnessed many rooms like the one he had just left, rooms filled with silence, shaped by grief, transformed by love. Each one held a story, a final chapter of someone's existence recorded through ritual and remembrance. As he began the journey home, the image of the prepared room lingered in his mind. It reminded him that death photography was not only about the dead, it was about the living, the ones left behind to stitch their memories together in whatever way they could. In the end, these rooms of silence were not places of despair. They were places where love had one final chance to speak. Some photographs stare back at you long after you've turned them face down. Not because the eyes are bright or full of life, but because they hold a stillness so profound that your mind struggles to make sense of it. These are the eyes that never close, the ones that belong to those who have already crossed the threshold between worlds. Yet in the early days of photography, families begged for those eyes to be opened again. If not in truth, then in illusion. In the 19th century, the human eye was a powerful symbol. A closed eye signified eternal rest, but an open one preserved something essential, a trace of presence, a tether to the world left behind. Families who had watched a loved one fade into stillness often could not bear to see them captured in a pose that appeared too final. They wanted them awake, aware, almost alive. And so photographers became illusionists, crafting the appearance of life through shadows, angle, and artistry. Of all the aspects of post-mortem portraiture, this was perhaps the most delicate and unsettling. For Elias Hart, this skill did not come easily. He had learned to position bodies, soften expressions, and arrange scenes with a quiet patience, but opening the eyes of the dead required a precision that bordered on the uncanny. It was not as simple as forcing eyelids apart. Doing so left the eyes dull, clouded, and unmistakably lifeless. Instead, photographers learned to work around closed lids, suggesting open eyes through careful placement of light and strategic use of painted pupils on glass overlays. Each illusion had to be subtle enough to avoid suspicion, yet convincing enough to ease the family's grief. In a winter morning, Elias received word from a family living in a secluded farmhouse near the cliffs. Their son, a young man who had spent his life working alongside his father in the fields, had died unexpectedly. His father described him with pride, strong, determined, and always awake before sunrise. The family wanted a final portrait that reflected that vitality. He must look awake, the father said. He must look as though he is still beside them, ready to lift the day's burdens. And so Elias prepared himself for one of the most difficult tasks in his profession.
The journey to the farmhouse was long, the road marked by patches of frozen mud and scattered remnants of last autumn's leaves. When Elias arrived, he found the family gathered around the young man's body, which had been placed on a sturdy wooden chair by the window. The room smelled faintly of smoke from the fireplace, mingling with the cold air that seeped in from cracks in the walls. The mother's hands trembled as she adjusted her son's collar, while the father stood behind him with a rigid composure that seemed too heavy to maintain. The young man had been dressed in his best work clothes, clean, pressed, and carefully arranged. His posture was held upright by a metal support hidden behind the chair, and his head rested at a slight angle as though listening to a distant sound. His eyes, closed in permanent stillness, contrasted sharply with the vitality his family remembered. They wanted those eyes open, but not in a way that betrayed the truth of what had happened. They wanted the illusion of life, the suggestion that he still gazed upon the world with determination. Elias studied the young man's face, memorizing the contours of his eyelids, the gentle slope of his eyebrows, the shadows cast by the soft winter light. He knew that the photograph would hinge on those shadows. Light could create depth where none existed. It could shape the lids into a semblance of openness, especially if angled correctly. The key was subtlety. Anything that looked artificial would destroy the illusion. He positioned the chair so that the light from the window fell directly across the young man's face. This illumination brightened the upper eyelids while casting a soft shadow beneath them, an effect that made it appear as though the eyes were slightly parted. He then placed a thin glass plate, painted with faint, carefully crafted pupils, near the lens. When combined with the angle of light, these painted pupils would subtly reflect onto the closed lids during exposure, suggesting depth where there was none. It was a technique whispered among photographers, one that required steady hands and a keen eye for detail. The mother watched anxiously as Elias adjusted the equipment. She clutched a folded handkerchief, twisting it between her fingers. Her eyes were red from crying, but they held a flicker of hope. The father, stoic and unmoving, stared at his son with an expression that conveyed more than grief. It was pride, sorrow, and denial blended into one. To him, the portrait would be more than a keepsake. It would be a defiance of fate, a refusal to let death dull the memory of the boy he had raised. When everything was finally aligned, Elias prepared the camera. The room grew even quieter than before, as though the air itself held its breath. He uncovered the lens, allowing light to spill through and imprint the image onto the plate. The exposure was long, and during those drawn-out seconds, the young man appeared eerily peaceful. The shadows worked their fragile magic, shaping the illusion of half-open eyes. In the stillness, Elias felt a strange pull, as though the young man's presence lingered in the room, caught between the weight of memory and the finality of death.
When the exposure ended, Elias stepped into his portable darkroom, the cramped space filled with the familiar scent of chemicals and wood. The image emerged slowly, as if fighting its way out of the shadows. First, the outline of the young man's face appeared, then the texture of his clothing, and finally, the subtle illusion of his eyes. They seemed almost open, not bright like the living, but thoughtful, reflective, as though he were looking gently toward the window. Elias felt a chill ripple up his spine. The effect was stronger than expected, almost too lifelike. When he brought the finished photograph to the family, the mother pressed the image to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She whispered a breathless sound that turned into a silent sob. The father studied the photograph with trembling fingers. His expression shifted from grief to something softer, something like solace. In the picture, their son did not appear dead. He appeared vigilant, as though resting momentarily before returning to his work. The illusion may have been constructed by light and technique, but the comfort it brought was undeniably real. As Elias prepared to leave, the parents stood together, holding the photograph between them as though it were a fragile treasure. He stepped outside and inhaled the crisp winter air, letting the cold settle into his lungs. The landscape around him was quiet, the fields blanketed by frost. In that silence, he reflected on the strange divide he walked each day, the line between truth and illusion, between life and the memory of life. The art of making eyes appear open was not one he enjoyed, but it was one he understood deeply. It served a need that no words could fill. Families did not want to remember the stillness of death. They wanted to remember the spark of the person they loved. And if a photograph could preserve even the faintest hint of that spark, then the illusion was worth creating. As Elias traveled away from the farmhouse, The memory of the young man's eyes lingered in his mind. They were eyes that would never open again in reality, but in the captured image, they conveyed a message of presence that transcended the boundary of death. In the world of post-mortem photography, the dead often left behind a final gift, one last look that the living could hold on to long after the world had moved on. And for Elias, that was the quiet, unsettling power of his craft, to create eyes that never closed, and to offer families one last glimpse of the life they had loved so fiercely. There are smiles that comfort, smiles that delight, and smiles that lift the weight of worry from a heavy heart. But then there are the smiles that unsettle, smiles shaped by hands rather than emotions, smiles placed upon faces that could no longer feel anything at all. These artificial expressions, crafted in the stillness of death, were among the most haunting creations of early photography. Among the rituals of post-mortem photography, the attempt to make the dead appear joyful was perhaps the most unsettling. Most families preferred peaceful expressions, faces shaped into serene rest. But on rare occasions, someone would request something different, something that walked a narrow line between comfort and denial. A smile, even a faint one, could become a symbol of hope or desperation. It could transform the photograph into an illusion of life that defied the reality of loss. These were the portraits that tested a photographer's resolve, challenging them to navigate grief with the delicate balance of artistry and compassion.
For Elias Hart, these requests were never simple. His profession had taught him to soften stiff limbs, to position bodies with dignity, and to manipulate light so that death's harsh features appeared gentle. But creating a smile required something more. It required a kind of emotional negotiation, an understanding of why the living clung so fiercely to an expression that no longer belonged to the dead. And on a stormy afternoon, as clouds pressed low over the hills, Elias received one of the most unusual requests of his career. A woman named Marin lived in a solitary home overlooking a quiet valley. Her husband, a carpenter known for his cheerful disposition, had passed unexpectedly. Their life together had been built on laughter, stories shared over warm meals, and the rhythm of work and rest that defined rural existence. When he died, the stillness left behind felt unbearable. It was not simply the loss of his presence, but the silence where his laughter once echoed. Marin wanted one final reminder of the joy he had brought into their lives, a tangible memory of the happiness that had defined their years together. She requested that Elias capture her husband with a faint smile, not an exaggerated grin, but a gentle expression of peace and warmth. Elias approached the house through rain-soaked pathways, noting how the landscape seemed subdued, as though nature itself had paused to mourn. Inside, the air carried the scent of freshly cut wood, remnants of the husband's final carpentry project resting unfinished in the corner. Marin stood beside the prepared body, her posture rigid, her face pale from grief, but determined. She had dressed her husband in a clean shirt he favored, smoothing the fabric carefully. His hands were folded, his hair brushed back, but his face remained fixed in the expression death had left him, calm, solemn, untouched by emotion. Elias studied his features with care. The man looked peaceful, but the solemnity of his expression contrasted sharply with the lively spirit Marin described. She wanted to see the man she had loved, the one who smiled even during difficult times, the one whose cheerfulness softened the burdens of their modest life.
For her, the smile was not a denial of death, but an affirmation of who he had been in life. The challenge lay in shaping an expression without distorting the dignity of the deceased. Too much manipulation would result in something grotesque or unnatural. Too little would fail to fulfill the emotional need behind the request. Elias understood that grief had a way of reshaping reality, and his role was to create an image that offered comfort without crossing into deception so blatant it shattered the illusion. He began by adjusting the lighting. The storm outside cast dull, uneven shadows across the room, making the man's features appear sharper than they truly were. Elias positioned a lamp to soften the shadows around his mouth, allowing the light to fall gently across his cheeks. Light was often the first tool in shaping expression, softening the contours that death tended to harden.
Next, he considered the facial muscles. The corners of the mouth, when lifted even slightly, could convey warmth or gentle joy. Using small, discreet supports beneath the fabric of the man's collar, he raised his head just enough to allow gravity to assist in shaping the mouth. Then, with a tiny wooden tool designed for these delicate tasks, he lifted the corners of the lips by the smallest measure. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible in the dim room, but it softened the solemnity of the face into an expression that suggested tranquility. Marin watched with a mixture of curiosity and sorrow. Her hands clasped together tightly, as though she feared that any sudden movement would disrupt the fragile work Elias was creating. There was a quiet reverence in her stillness, a recognition that this moment carried weight far beyond the practical task at hand. She was not simply preparing her husband for a photograph. She was preparing herself for a world without him. Once the expression felt natural and the lighting balanced the soft shadows, Elias arranged the man's posture. He adjusted the tilt of the head so that the smile, subtle though it was, caught the light in a way that emphasized its gentleness. The man's eyes, closed in peaceful rest, complemented the softness of the newly shaped expression. It was a quiet smile, one that carried no joy from the present but held echoes of joy from the past. When everything was ready, Elias set up his camera. The rain continued tapping softly against the window, providing a rhythmic backdrop to the solemn work. The exposure time felt longer than usual. Perhaps it was the dimness of the storm-lit room, or perhaps it was the weight of what the photograph represented. During those seconds of absolute stillness, the illusion of a peaceful smile seemed fragile, as though a shift in the wind might dissolve it. When the exposure was complete, Elias retreated to his portable darkroom to develop the plate. The image appeared gradually, emerging from the chemical wash like a memory, crystallizing in the mind. The first thing to materialize was the soft glow of light across the man's cheeks. Then, the gentle curve of his lips. The illusion was subtle but unmistakable. He looked content, as though resting after a long day's work, his expression carrying the warmth his wife remembered so vividly. When Elias presented the photograph to Marin, she held it with trembling hands. Her breath caught as she studied the image, her grief mingling with a tender smile of her own. The photograph captured exactly what she had hoped for, a final echo of her husband's spirit, a last glimpse of the man she loved. It did not erase her sorrow, but it offered something precious to carry into the lonely days ahead.
As Elias packed his equipment and stepped back into the storm, he felt the peculiar mixture of relief and solemnity that accompanied such work. The rain had softened, leaving the valley shrouded in mist. The path glistened beneath his boots, reflecting the pale light of the overcast sky. He walked slowly, contemplating the strange nature of the smile he had crafted. It was a smile made not from muscles or emotions, but from memory and longing.
In the world of post-mortem photography, a smile was not a deception, it was a bridge between what was lost and what remained, between grief and the fragile hope that love endures beyond the boundary of life. The smiles he crafted were not expressions of joy, they were expressions of remembrance. And as he continued his journey through that quiet valley, Elias understood that these rare, delicate smiles carried a kind of truth deeper than any candid portrait could capture. They were the final expressions of human love, shaped by hands trembling with grief, preserved on plates of silver and glass, and passed down through generations as a testament to the bonds that death could not entirely break. Some stories linger in the corners of history like faint echoes, too fragile to speak of loudly, yet too sorrowful to forget. Among them are the stories of children whose lives ended before they truly began, children who left behind only silence, soft blankets, and the lingering scent of innocence. In an era when childhood was not a promise but a fragile hope, post-mortem photography became the only way many families preserved the memory of a life measured in brief seasons. In the 19th century, child mortality hovered over every household like a silent specter. Illnesses struck without warning, and even the mildest fever could steal a child away in a single night. Families lived with the constant fear that laughter echoing through their homes might fall quiet at any moment. And when that terrible silence arrived, they found themselves grasping for something that could help preserve the small details that grief threatened to blur. Post-mortem photographs of children were not curiosities, they were lifelines, final reminders that a short life had still been a life worth remembering. For Elias Hart, photographing children was the most emotionally fragile part of his work. Adults carried the marks of time, shadows around their eyes, lines on their skin, histories etched into their expressions. Children, however, were symbols of beginnings, symbols of hope. Their loss felt like the closing of a book before the first chapter had even been written. Each time Elias approached a household mourning a child, he felt the weight of their grief settle over him like a heavy cloak. He understood that these photographs were not merely mementos. They were anchors for families adrift in sorrow.
One morning, Elias received a message from a family in a distant mountain village. Their young daughter, Alea, had passed after a brief illness that swept through the region. They wished for a photograph, one final portrait to hold on to in the years ahead. The journey to the village was long and arduous, requiring Elias to traverse steep paths lined with jagged stones and thick patches of winter-hardened brambles. The air grew colder as he ascended, and the sky hung low with heavy clouds that threatened snow. When he reached the village, he found it quiet, its cabins scattered across the mountain slope like lonely sentinels. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin spirals, disappearing quickly into the frigid air. The family lived at the far edge of the settlement, in a small wooden home with a narrow porch and a roof weighed down by frost. As Elias approached, he saw small footprints in the snow, marks made by cousins or siblings who had gathered earlier to offer their condolences. The house itself seemed to breathe sorrow. Inside, the warmth of the hearth barely softened the chill in the air. The mother sat in a wooden chair near a low table, her hands resting on a folded quilt. Her eyes were swollen, though her expression remained calm in a way that only exhaustion and heartbreak could produce. The father stood behind her, his posture rigid, his grief palpable. On a small bed near the window lay their daughter, dressed in a simple white gown. Her hair, once full of movement, had been brushed into soft curls. Elias looked like she was sleeping, but the room carried the unmistakable stillness that only death brings. Elias took a moment to breathe, steadying himself before he approached the child. She had delicate features and round cheeks that still held a hint of softness. The illness had not left visible marks, and for that the family was grateful. They wanted her remembered as she had been, gentle, lively, and full of curiosity about the world around her. Elias felt his throat tighten as he observed her small hands resting beside a wreath of dried flowers. These were the scenes that tested the emotional boundaries of his craft, forcing him to remain composed while his heart pulled in the opposite direction. First came the preparation. The mother rose slowly, touching her daughter's hair one last time before allowing Elias to work. He adjusted the quilt, smoothing it around the child to create a sense of peaceful repose. He positioned her hands carefully, giving them the appearance of natural rest rather than forced stillness. He tilted her head ever so slightly so that the soft mountain light from the window fell across her face, lending warmth to her pale complexion. The snowy landscape outside created a gentle reflection on the glass, filtering the illumination to a soft glow that seemed to cradle the child with tenderness. The father contributed by placing a small wooden toy, a carved bird, near her hands. Elias had cherished it, carrying it everywhere she went, its wings worn smooth from her touch. The toy added a human element to the portrait, a reminder that the child had been loved, that she had lived with joy even in her brief time on earth. Elias recognized the importance of such personal objects. They told a story beyond the photograph, a testament to the child's short but meaningful existence.
As Elias prepared his camera, the mother whispered a silent prayer, her hands clasped together. She did not speak aloud, but the emotion in her posture conveyed all that words could not. The father rested his hand on her shoulder, though even his touch carried the tremor of a man struggling to stand under the weight of loss. Elias positioned himself carefully, adjusting the camera's angle to capture the child as though she were resting peacefully after a day of play in the snowy mountains. The exposure began. The room fell still, so still that Elias could hear the faint crackle of the hearth behind him. The long seconds stretched like strands of time pulled taut, fragile and trembling. In those moments, the child's stillness seemed almost serene. The wreath of flowers framed her small form with gentle grace, the carved bird resting beside her as a symbol of innocence. The light from the window cast a soft glow across her face, enhancing the peacefulness of the scene. When the exposure ended, Elias moved to his portable darkroom. The chemicals reacted slowly in the cold mountain air, forming faint patterns that slowly resolved into the image. As her face appeared on the plate, Elias felt a familiar ache, a mingling of sorrow and reverence. The photograph captured her with such tenderness that he knew it would become a cherished relic for the family. The gentle tilt of her head, the soft fall of her hair, the faint reflection of light across her cheek, all of it formed a portrait filled with the lingering echo of her presence. When Elias presented the photograph to the parents, the mother held it with trembling hands. Ayala looked peaceful, as though she had simply drifted into a quiet dream. The father closed his eyes as he stood beside his wife, allowing the weight of emotion to wash over him. They did not cry immediately. Instead, a solemn stillness filled the room, a moment of quiet acknowledgement that their daughter's image had been preserved in a way that honored her memory. Elias remained with the family for a short time, offering them a few moments of shared silence before packing his equipment. As he stepped outside, he felt the chill of the mountain air bite through his coat. Snow had begun to fall, lightly at first, then steadily, covering the ground in a fresh layer of white. The village below lay blanketed in the same soft quiet, the world seeming almost suspended in its grief. On his journey back down the mountain, Elias found himself reflecting on the fragility of childhood in a world shaped by illness and hardship. The stories he carried with him, the photographs of children he had preserved, formed a silent archive of lives cut short. And yet, in each image, he had captured a spark of the love that had surrounded those children. Love that endured even after breath had left their small bodies.
Death photography, for all its somber nature, revealed something profoundly human. It was a testament to the tenderness that the living held for the lost. In those photographs, children continued to exist, not as fading memories, but as preserved moments of innocence, forever cradled in the hearts of those who had loved them beyond measure. As Elias continued his descent, snowflakes melting on his gloves, he understood that these portraits were more than images. They were fragments of stories, preserved against the erasure of time. And each child he photographed became a whisper carried forward through generations. Children of the shadows, no longer alone in the cold silence of memory. Some images seem to breathe long after they are created, as if something within them refuses to remain still. Shadows linger where they shouldn't, reflections appear where no light should fall, and faint figures emerge in corners where no one had stood. These are the photographs that whisper rather than speak, the ones that suggest the dead were not entirely ready to disappear. In the earliest days of photography, capturing an image required patience, precision, and a quiet surrender to the unpredictable. Long exposures, fragile glass plates, and temperamental chemicals created photographs that were art and accident. When the subject was living, these imperfections were often subtle, an unintended blur, a softened edge, or a distortion caused by the slightest movement. But when the subject was dead, these accidents took on an eerie character. A slight shift of a limb, a tilt of the head, or the merging of light and shadow could give the impression that something else, something unseen, had entered the frame. Elias Hart had seen his share of such unsettling occurrences. He understood that they were merely the product of technical limitations, yet the emotional weight carried by post-mortem photography gave these distortions a deeper resonance. Families were already vulnerable, grieving, and reaching for any sign that their loved one still lingered in some form. When a shadow fell unexpectedly across a photograph, or a faint double exposure made a figure appear twice, they often interpreted it not as a mistake, but as a trace left behind by the departed. It was late autumn when Elias Hart received a request from a family living on the edge of a dense pine forest. The letter had been written in hurried strokes, the ink smeared in places, as though penned through tears. Their eldest sister had died after a prolonged illness that had left the household exhausted and hollow. They wanted a final photograph, simple, dignified, and illuminated by the soft light that filtered through the forest canopy. Elias packed his equipment and made the journey with a sense of solemn purpose. The house stood at the end of a narrow path, surrounded by towering pines whose branches interlocked overhead like silent sentinels. The air smelled of sap and damp earth, and the wind carried a faint whispering sound that seemed to follow Elias as he walked. When he entered the home, he found a room prepared with care. The deceased woman lay on a bed near a window, her hands folded over a faded quilt stitched with patterns worn by time. Her siblings had dressed her in a clean gown, woven her hair into a simple braid, and placed a pressed flower between her hands. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the wind threading through the trees.
What struck Elias most was the expression on her face. It was neither peaceful nor tense. It was vacant,
as though she had left her body behind days before her final breath. He recognized this emptiness. It was common among those who had suffered long illnesses, their spirits worn thin by pain and fatigue. For the family, the photograph would serve as a reminder not of her suffering, but of her quiet presence, her gentle nature, and the life she had lived before sickness overtook her. Elias arranged his equipment carefully. He placed the camera at an angle that allowed the light from the window to fall across her face in a soft, even glow. He adjusted her posture slightly, lifting her chin and turning her head toward the light. The siblings watched in silent anticipation, their eyes filled with a mixture of grief and hope. They had lost not just a sister, but a guiding force in their lives. The photograph would be a relic, a piece of her memory preserved against the erosion of time. When the exposure began, the room seemed to hold its breath. The long seconds stretched as Elias maintained his focus, ensuring no movement disrupted the delicate balance of light and shadow. The forest outside remained still for a moment, as though nature itself was aware of the solemnity taking place. When the exposure ended, Elias carried the plate into the small darkroom he had assembled near the entrance, shielding it from the faint drafts that crept through the walls. Inside the darkroom, the air smelled sharply of chemicals. Elias worked steadily, his hands moving with practiced precision as the image slowly surfaced. At first, only the outline of the woman's face appeared, emerging from the depth of shadows. Then the faint glimmer of light across her forehead. Then the curve of her hands resting on the quilt. But something felt wrong. A faint blur lingered near the edge of the plate, something he could not immediately identify. He leaned closer, examining the plate under the dim red light. The woman's form was clear, but beside her, near the window, a faint silhouette appeared. It was indistinct, like a smudge or fog, yet its shape was too deliberate to be dismissed entirely. It leaned toward her slightly, its form softened by the grain of the photograph, but still visible enough to evoke an unsettling sensation. Elias felt a cold ripple pass through him. He recognized this phenomenon, though rarely did it occur with such clarity. It was a double exposure, an accidental imprint caused by a previous, faintly developed image re-emerging on the plate. Yet he knew the family would not see it that way. To them, it might appear as a spirit, a presence lingering in the final moments. Some families found comfort in such illusions. Others became consumed by fear or superstition. Elias had learned that grief sharpened the mind's hunger for signs, for meaning, for anything that suggested the dead remained close.
He developed the photograph fully, hoping the silhouette would fade as the chemicals settled. But it remained faint, but undeniably there. Elias considered his options. He could attempt another photograph, but the light was fading, and the process would require resetting the scene entirely. The siblings were exhausted, their grief weighing heavily on their shoulders. Asking them to undergo the ritual again felt insensitive. Yet presenting the image without preparation could lead them into a deeper emotional spiral. After careful thought, Elias returned to the family, holding the photograph gently between his hands. They gathered around the table, leaning close to study their sister's final portrait. Their expressions softened as they took in the peaceful arrangement, the tender glow of light across her face. It was only when their eyes drifted to the faint silhouette near the window that the room shifted. The youngest sibling stepped back, covering their mouth in disbelief. The others stared, their grief momentarily replaced by confusion. Elias remained silent, allowing them to interpret the image on their own.
In the quiet that followed, their expressions changed, not to fear, but to something unexpected. The eldest sibling reached out, touching the photograph lightly. He explained in a trembling voice that their mother had died in the same room years earlier, tending to the sister who now lay still. To him, the silhouette represented not a mistake, but a comforting possibility that in her final moment, she had not been alone. The others followed his interpretation, and the room slowly filled with a kind of reverent calm. Elias watched as the photograph became more than a memorial. It became a symbol of continuity, of presence, of familial bonds that extended beyond life. In this moment, he understood that the power of a photograph was not held solely in its accuracy, but in the emotion it invoked. As Elias packed his equipment, the forest outside seemed to whisper again, the wind weaving its soft murmur through the branches. The siblings placed the photograph on a small table near the window, allowing it to rest in the same gentle light that had shaped its creation. The faint silhouette no longer felt unsettling to them. It felt protective. On his journey home, Elias reflected on the unpredictable nature of his craft, the accidents, the blurs, the unexpected shapes. They were technical imperfections, yet they often carried emotional meaning far beyond their cause. In a time when grief was ever present and the boundary between the living and the dead felt thin, these ghost-like figures on glass became vessels for longing, memory, and solace. Ghosts on glass were not spirits, not in any literal sense. They were remnants of chemistry, chance, and the unpredictable dance of light. But in the hearts of the grieving, they became something more. They became a whisper that said the dead were not entirely gone, that a piece of them lingered in the world they left behind.
Some professions carve their names into history with bold strokes. Leaders, warriors, inventors, artists. Others, however, leave their marks quietly, working in shadows where few dare linger. Among them were the men who carried their cameras into rooms filled with grief, who stood at the fragile boundary between life and death, who captured the last trace of a human presence before it slipped completely into memory. These were the photographers of the dead, craftsmen whose hands shaped the only images many families would ever possess of their lost loved ones. To understand the weight carried by these photographers, one must imagine the world they inhabited. Grief was not an occasional visitor. It was a constant presence in every village, town, and city. Every year brought waves of illness, famine, accidents, and unyielding hardship. Photographs of the living were rare luxuries, treasures reserved for the wealthy or the fortunate. Yet photographs of the dead were surprisingly more accessible, not because they were cheaper, but because they were seen as essential. The dead did not move or blink or shift in impatience. They simply lay still, waiting to be preserved. And so the photographers who specialized in these final portraits became unlikely pillars of solace. Elias Hart had slowly become one of these men. Though he had never intended to dedicate his craft to death, fate led him down a path where grieving families sought him out more frequently than the joyful ones. He learned how to read a room filled with mourning, how to move gently, how to breathe softly, how to let silence shape his presence. He understood that his purpose was not only to capture an image, but to serve as a quiet guide for families navigating their first hours of loss. But Elias was not the only one who walked this path. Across the countryside, in towns both large and small, there were others who carried their heavy cameras and fragile plates from home to home. Each of them had their own methods, their own philosophies, their own burdens. And among them was a man who had mastered the craft with an unsettling level of precision, a photographer named Alistair Quinn.
Alistair was known for creating some of the most lifelike post-mortem portraits any had ever seen. His images bore expressions of serene contentment, gentle smiles, and eyes that appeared softly aware. Families traveled long distances to request his services, believing he possessed some rare gift that allowed the dead to look more alive than they had in their final days. His reputation spread through whispers, admiration mixed with unease. For while his photographs offered comfort, they also carried an odd sense of vitality, as though life had been drawn back into the bodies through the lens of his camera. Elias first heard of Alistair during a visit to a bustling town market. A merchant showed him one of the renowned photographs, speaking in awed tones about its realism. The image depicted a young woman resting in a chair, her posture natural, her expression touched with the faintest smile. Her eyes, though closed, gave the illusion of gentle awareness due to the way the shadows played across her lids. Elias studied the photograph with quiet fascination. The technique was extraordinary, delicately balanced between illusion and authenticity. But something in the details unsettled him. It was not the craftsmanship itself, it was the sense that the photograph held too much presence, as though the woman had been pulled from memory rather than captured in death.
Months later, Elias had the chance to meet Alistair. Their paths crossed when both were summoned by different families in the same small town. Alistair was older, his posture stiff from years of carrying heavy equipment, his hands steady with practiced precision. He had a calm demeanor, though his eyes held a depth that hinted at secrets accumulated over countless hours spent in rooms where sorrow reigned. People respected him, but they also kept a cautious distance, as though lingering too long in his presence might draw them into the strange world he inhabited. While Elias worked quietly and respectfully, Alistair approached his craft almost ritualistically. He examined each detail of the deceased with the same intensity an artist might use when studying a living subject. He adjusted limbs with meticulous care, softened facial expressions with subtle touches, and manipulated light until it shaped the illusion he desired. But what Elias found most intriguing and unsettling was the small case Alistair kept with him at all times. Inside were delicate tools, finely crafted supports, polished rods, specialized clamps, and tiny brushes meant for shaping expressions. These tools allowed him to arrange the dead with unmatched precision, creating portraits that nearly defied their somber purpose. It was during a long winter season that Elias learned the truth behind Alistair's mastery. A wealthy family in a distant village requested both photographers for a complex task, a joint portrait of two deceased siblings. They believed the combined skills of both men would preserve the memory of their children in a way that one might not achieve alone. Elias felt uneasy about the collaboration, but professional pride urged him forward. The village lay deep in a valley where snow covered rooftops like a shroud, and the cold crept into bones with relentless persistence. The family's home was large and meticulously kept, filled with relics of comfort and warmth that contrasted sharply with the sorrow saturating the atmosphere. The two children, a boy and a girl, lay side by side on a bed of white linens, their hands intertwined. They appeared peaceful, untouched by the illness that had claimed them. As Elias and Alistair prepared their equipment, the room filled with a stillness so profound it seemed to swallow sound. Elias began arranging the siblings with gentle adjustments, mindful of preserving their innocence. Alistair watched for a moment, then stepped forward, opening his case of tools with a deliberate motion. What followed unsettled Elias deeply. Alistair worked with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He adjusted the children's expressions not to reflect peace, but to evoke a faint trace of joy. He shaped their faces as though sculpting clay, tilting their heads to catch the light in a way that suggested life's lingering presence.
His hands moved with a precision that Elias had never seen. Yet it was not the skill itself that caused concern. It was the emotional disconnect beneath it. Alistair's eyes held no empathy. Instead, they held a kind of cold fascination, as if he were trying to reclaim something that had already slipped beyond reach.
Elias felt the weight of the moment as he watched. This was more than simple artistry. It was transformation. Alistair's photographs did not merely soften the reality of death. They reimagined it. They offered families an illusion so strong that it risked blurring the line between memory and truth. Despite his unease, Elias continued the work, focusing on his role in capturing the scene with dignity. When the exposure was taken and the image developed, the result was hauntingly beautiful. The children appeared peaceful, serene, and touched with a faint happiness that seemed impossible for those who had slipped into eternal rest. The family reacted with tears of gratitude, their grief momentarily eased by the comforting illusion. Yet for Elias, the image lingered with an unsettling weight. The craftsmanship was unmatched, but the emotional hollowness behind it left a trace of discomfort he could not shake. He realized then that the photographers of the dead each carried different burdens. Some, like himself, served grief with quiet empathy. Others, like Alistair, wielded their craft as a means of control, over memory, over sorrow, perhaps even over death itself. As time passed, Elias continued his work with a renewed understanding of the delicate balance required in his profession. Post-mortem photography was not merely about creating an image. It was about honoring a life without distorting its truth. The dead deserved dignity, not reinvention, and the living deserved honesty, not illusions that might fracture under the weight of reality. Photographers of the dead carried heavy responsibilities, but their greatest burden was the trust placed in their hands. They shaped memories, influenced grief, and preserved the final trace of a person's presence. Through their lenses, they bridged the gap between life and death, offering families a fragile comfort in the midst of profound loss. Elias Hart walked this path with reverence, aware of the shadows that followed him. He understood that each photograph he created would outlive him, passed down through generations as a silent testament to the bond between the living and the lost. And as he continued on his journey, he carried with him the quiet promise that his craft would remain grounded in respect, even when others chose a different path. Some photographs do not wait to haunt you. They reach through time the moment your eyes meet them. You sense something wet in the corners of those captured eyes, something heavy in the way the light clings to their lashes. They look as though grief itself is seeping from their stillness. These are the portraits that appear to weep, images where the emotion of the living has settled upon the dead like a second skin. There were moments when Elias Hart believed that grief had a way of imprinting itself onto the faces of the dead. It was not the body releasing tears, it was the weight of the room pressing itself into the expression, the reflection of sorrow left by the people who surrounded the still form. The living cried so fiercely, so endlessly, that it felt as though the dead began to carry the traces of their sorrow in the curve of a mouth, the angle of a brow, or the faint shine in an unblinking eye. These accidental illusions became some of the most emotional images families ever received. Photographs that held sorrow with such delicate intensity that they seemed alive with feeling.
It happened most often in homes overflowing with heartbreak. Houses where an entire family had gathered, where every breath felt soaked in grief, where every shadow seemed to tremble beneath the weight of loss. Elias had witnessed many such scenes,
but none compared to the day he visited a small riverside cottage, where a mother mourned the loss of her infant son with a grief so raw it seemed to echo through the walls. The cottage stood at the edge of a slow-moving river, its wooden planks weathered by years of storms. Soft reeds swayed along the water's edge, whispering in the quiet breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and river moss. The mother sat near the hearth, her shoulders shaking as she held her child's blanket close to her chest. The father hovered nearby, his expression hollow, his posture slumped as though the structure of his life had been pulled from beneath him. The child lay in a small cradle covered with a woven cloth. His features were delicate, untouched by the harshness that sometimes left behind. His tiny hands rested by his sides, fingers slightly curled. He looked peaceful, but the grief in the room pressed so heavily around him that even his stillness seemed weighed down by sorrow. Elias approached with quiet steps, careful not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. As he arranged his equipment, he noticed something unusual. The infant's eyes were partially open, rare for one so young, and the faintest glimmer of moisture clung to the lower lids. It was not a tear, not in the human sense. It was the natural settling of fluid that sometimes occurred after death. But with the light shining through the small window, the effect was striking. It made the child's eyes appear as though they were welling with sadness, mirroring the devastation of the family gathered around him. Elias adjusted the lighting carefully. Soft light reduced harsh reflections, but in this case, he allowed a gentle highlight to remain. It caught the edges of the child's lashes, creating a delicate shimmer that looked heartbreakingly alive. The photograph he was about to capture would be one of the most emotional he had ever taken. The mother stepped closer, her breathing uneven, her eyes swollen and red. She reached out to smooth her son's hair, her hand trembling. Her tears fell silently, one by one, landing softly on the woven cloth. The father placed his hand on her shoulder, yet even his presence carried a sense of a man overwhelmed by sorrow. It was in their grief that the room seemed to bend, as though the air itself softened around them. Elias began the exposure. The long seconds demanded absolute stillness, yet in that stillness, the room vibrated with emotion. The quiet was not empty. It was full of suspended breaths, muffled sobs, and the lingering beat of a grief that had not yet learned how to settle. The light from the window glowed across the child's face, accentuating the faint shine in his half-open eyes. Elias felt the moment settle into him with an ache he could not ignore. When the exposure ended, he retreated to his portable darkroom. The chemicals hissed softly, the image emerging with slow, deliberate clarity. The infant's face appeared first, serene yet touched with an emotion that surpassed simple stillness. The faint shimmer near the eyes took form, creating an illusion so tender and sorrowful that Elias paused in his work. The photograph looked as though the child was crying, not from pain, but from the collective grief that filled the room like a deep current. When Elias returned to the family with the finished portrait, the mother collapsed into her husband's arms, clutching the photograph to her chest. She stared at it for a long time, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. The father bowed his head, his throat tightening as he gazed upon the fragile image. It was a portrait that seemed to speak directly to their grief, reflecting back the weight of their heartbreak with impossible gentleness. But the phenomenon was not unique to infants. Elias had seen similar photographs among the elderly, the young, the strong, and the frail. Once he photographed an elderly man whose daughter wept so fervently beside him that her tears fell onto his face during the arrangement. Elias wiped the droplets away, but a faint sheen remained on the skin, catching the light in a way that created a haunting suggestion of tears that had never fallen during life. The daughter later told him she believed the image represented her father's sorrow at leaving the family behind. There were times when shadows created similar illusions. A family once requested a portrait of a teenage boy who had drowned in a nearby lake. His damp hair clung to his forehead, and the natural moisture on his skin created uneven reflections. The final photograph captured a solemn face with faint dark tracks under the eyes, as though tears had rolled down moments before he entered eternal rest. His mother looked at the image for hours, tracing those darkened lines with trembling fingers, believing they showed his sorrow in his final moments. Elias understood that these effects were unintentional, products of light, moisture, shadow, and the natural stillness of death. Yet he also understood that grief saw meaning in everything. The human heart found solace in believing the dead still felt something, even if that emotion was sorrow. It created a connection, a bridge across the chasm of loss. Not all families reacted with comfort. In one household, the faint tear-like reflections caused the youngest child to scream in fear, believing their mother was crying from the afterlife. For days, the family shrouded the photograph, unsure whether to keep it or destroy it. Elias learned that the emotional impact of these images could be unpredictable, shaped by the vulnerability of the grieving. But perhaps the most haunting moment Elias ever witnessed occurred in a dim parlor where the deceased was a young woman who had cared for her entire family. Her siblings surrounded her bed as Elias prepared the portrait. The mother sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while the father rested against the wall, barely able to stand beneath the weight of loss. The room smelled of herbs and candle wax, the last remnants of desperate attempts to keep illness at bay.
As Elias developed the photograph, he noticed a faint streak trailing down the woman's cheek. It was not moisture, nor a shadow cast by the lighting. It was a trick of the developing process, a subtle irregularity in the emulsion that formed a thin line. But its placement was uncanny. It fell exactly where a tear would have fallen, creating the unmistakable impression that she had shed one final tear as death took her. When her family saw the portrait, they believed it was a sign that she had released her final sorrow, that her last tear carried the weight of all the burdens she had held silently during life. They cherished the image beyond anything Elias had ever produced. To them, it was a final message from the woman who had sacrificed so much. Elias carried these experiences with him like quiet ghosts. He knew that the portraits were illusions created by chance and technique, yet he also saw how deeply they affected those who received them. The tears, the shine, the subtle lines, each held the potential to transform grief into meaning. As he walked from home to home, carrying his camera like a lantern in the dark, Elias realized that the portraits that cried were more than accidents of chemistry. They were mirrors, reflecting the love, grief, and longing of the living. And perhaps that was why they felt so alive. The tears captured on glass were not shed by the dead. They were shed by the hearts that refused to let them go. Some traditions fade quietly, slipping out of the world the same way twilight gives way to night, softly, gradually, almost unnoticed. Others vanish with a suddenness that leaves behind a hollow echo, as though a door was closed too quickly. The tradition of death photography did not disappear in a single moment, yet its decline carried a feeling of abruptness,
as if the world collectively exhaled and stepped away from a practice that had once been woven into the fabric of grief itself. For decades, post-mortem photography had been a lifeline for grieving families, a tender ritual that held sorrow in place long enough for healing to take its first tentative steps. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world began to change with a speed unfamiliar to those who had grown up in the shadow of mortality. Science advanced, medicine improved, cities grew, people lived longer, healthier lives, and as life extended, death retreated slightly from the center of everyday existence. Homes that once held death in quiet acceptance began to embrace a new kind of living, one shaped by optimism, progress, and the belief that the future held more promise than the past. The unfamiliar sight of photographers traveling from home to home grew rarer. Families no longer reached for the camera in moments of crisis. Instead, they used it during celebrations, gatherings, or simple afternoons spent in sunlight. The camera became an instrument of life rather than a witness to its end. For Elias Hart, this shift was both a relief and a quiet sorrow. He had dedicated years to capturing the final moments of countless lives, preserving memories with a reverence that defined him. Yet as fewer families requested his services for the dead, he sensed the world moving in a new direction. The grief he had once seen in every village now appeared more private, more contained. People processed their losses differently, supported by a growing network of doctors, community leaders, and the rise of specialized funeral services.
The turning point for Elias arrived on a warm spring morning when he received a letter from a wealthy family whose patriarch had passed after a long illness. It was not unusual for such families to request a portrait, yet the tone of the letter surprised him. They wished for an image, but not taken in the home. They requested instead that the deceased be taken to a new funeral parlor in the city, where professionals would prepare the body. Elias felt a pang of longing as he read the request. The intimacy of post-mortem photography had always been rooted in the home, where the living surrounded the dead with love and memory. But now the ritual was shifting to distant places, shaped by strangers and institutions. Still, Elias accepted the request. He felt compelled to witness the changing world firsthand. When he arrived at the new funeral establishment, a building of dark brick and polished doors, he sensed the difference immediately. The air felt sterile, lacking the warmth of a home filled with memories. Candles replaced hearth fires, and heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the bustling streets outside. The patriarch lay on a raised table draped in rich fabrics, his features arranged neatly by hands that did not know him, hands trained to prepare the dead with practiced efficiency. The family entered the room quietly, dressed in dark clothing. Their grief was present but muted, shaped by the formality of the environment rather than the raw, unfiltered sorrow Elias had grown accustomed to. They stood in silence as Elias prepared his equipment, their eyes rarely leaving the still form of the man who had once guided their lives. Yet something felt distant, an emotional gap widened by this new structured space where professional detachment replaced familial tenderness. When Elias took the photograph, the exposure felt different. The moment lacked the intimate atmosphere he had known in countless bedrooms, parlors, and farmhouses. There was no handmade quilt draped lovingly across the body, no family member brushing a final strand of hair into place, no quiet murmurs of remembrance. The photograph he produced was clean, composed, and empty of the emotional richness that had defined his earlier work. As he handed the finished portrait to the family, he sensed their appreciation, but also an unsettling detachment. They accepted it with polite gratitude, as though receiving a formal document rather than the last image of a beloved parent. Something had changed, perhaps irreversibly. The decline continued quietly.
Few letters arrived requesting his presence at homes. Instead, people sought portraits of the living, preferring to capture birthdays, weddings, newborns, and gatherings. Families began documenting life long before death arrived, filling albums with images that preserved smiles, joys, and shared moments in vivid clarity. Death photography no longer served as the primary means of remembrance.
Elias adapted, photographing families in parks, children in sunlit fields, and couples beneath blooming trees. Yet even as he embraced these new responsibilities, he carried a lingering ache for the intimacy he had once shared with grieving families. He missed the quiet reverence, the way each photograph felt like a final gift offered with trembling hands. One day, a letter arrived from a small village where Elias had once taken many post-mortem portraits. The sender was an elderly woman he had photographed decades earlier as she held her deceased husband in her lap. Now she wished for a portrait of herself, alive. She mentioned that she had displayed the photograph he had taken all these years, and it remained her most treasured possession. But she wanted something different now, a photograph of the life she had lived after loss. Elias traveled to the village with a mixture of nostalgia and humility. The woman greeted him with a gentle smile, her hair silver and her hands wrinkled from years of work. She invited him to her garden, where sunlight filtered through apple trees and a faint breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. As Elias arranged his camera, she sat on a wooden bench, her eyes bright and steady. She told him her story, not through words he could hear, but through the quiet dignity in her posture, the softness of her gaze, and the strength lingering in the creases of her face. This was a portrait of survival, of resilience, of a life lived fully despite loss. Elias captured the image with reverence, sensing that it held as much emotional weight as any post-mortem photograph he had ever taken. As he traveled home, he understood something essential. The decline of death photography did not signify a loss of meaning. It marked a shift in how people chose to remember. Instead of one final image, families now collected memories over time. Instead of a single still moment, they preserved laughter, growth, and joy. The camera had moved from the realm of sorrow into the realm of life. And though Elias no longer carried the same burden he once had, he realized that his craft had not become obsolete. It had transformed. The essence of remembrance endured, simply taking on new forms. The era of death photography faded, but the stories it held did not. They remained etched into the photographs that survived, each image a quiet testament to the love that once shaped them. The world had moved on, but the memories, preserved through Elias's lens, lingered in the homes and hearts of all who treasured them. Some memories do not fade with time. Instead, they settle into the corners of our lives like quiet ghosts. They linger on shelves, tucked inside old boxes and forgotten albums, waiting for the moment someone lifts away the dust and lets them breathe again. Among the most haunting of these relics are the post-mortem photographs of the past. Images that hold the weight of finality, yet whisper with the tenderness of remembrance. Long after the world moved on from the practice of death photography, the images remained, tucked away in attics, hidden in drawers, preserved in archives, and rediscovered by generations who did not fully understand the emotions they held. These photographs survived not because they were morbid curiosities, but because they captured something profound. The final presence of a person loved so deeply that even death could not sever their connection to the living. Through these images, emotions echoed across time, resonating in the hearts of those who gazed upon them decades or even centuries later.
Elias Hart lived long enough to witness this shift.
He grew old in a world that had embraced new rituals, new technologies, and new ways of grieving. Yet the memory of his early years, the quiet rooms, the soft lamplight, the trembling hands of grieving families never left him. Even as photography evolved into a vibrant craft filled with color and movement, Elias felt a quiet pull toward the shadows of the past, where he had once worked silently to preserve the presence of the dead. When he retired from his profession, Elias stored his old camera in a wooden trunk. Alongside it, he placed stacks of plates and prints. Some commissioned portraits, others created as studies of light and shadow. Yet among them were the images he cherished most, the ones he seldom showed to anyone. These were not his finest technical works, nor his most celebrated. They were the photographs he had taken of those who had slipped into quiet rest, families who had allowed him to become part of their grief for a fleeting moment. Each image held a fragment of a story, echoes of love, sorrow, fear, and resilience. Years passed. Winter after winter laid its frost upon the fields outside his small home. The world around him filled with the laughter of children holding small, lightweight cameras, capturing life with an ease that once would have seemed like magic. Photographs became abundant, no longer rare treasures, but everyday artifacts. Yet despite the abundance, people never fully lost their fascination with the old post-mortem portraits. The photographs resurfaced in antique shops, estate sales, and dusty trunks inherited by distant relatives. Historians, collectors, and curious minds pored over them, searching for meaning in their stillness. Some found comfort in these images, seeing in them a reflection of the past's acceptance of death. Others felt a chill, struck by the intimacy and vulnerability captured on those old plates. But all who saw them felt something, an emotional echo from a time when life was fragile enough that the final photograph carried a weight few modern images could replicate. Elias, now an old man with silver hair and eyes softened by years of reflection, found himself drawn back to the dark room one last time. The small, windowless space was filled with the scent of chemicals and memories. The wooden table still bore marks from decades of careful preparation. The red lamp above the basin cast a soft glow that reminded him of countless nights spent shaping images out of shadows. He ran his fingers along the edges of the table, feeling the grooves worn by time. From his trunk, he retrieved a handful of plates, his earliest work, fragile and tinged with the imperfections of a young photographer still learning to navigate the delicate world of grief. There was the image of the child with the faint smile, the mother dressed in her favorite gown, the siblings resting together in peaceful stillness. Each image carried him back to the moment it was taken, to the quiet rooms where families whispered their farewells while he captured a final trace of presence.
He placed one of the plates on the table, a portrait of a young woman from decades earlier. She had been the subject of one of his most emotional commissions, her family devastated by her untimely death. Elias remembered adjusting her posture, positioning her near a window that cast gentle light across her face. He remembered the grief in her mother's eyes, the way her father held his breath as he watched Elias work. The final image had captured her in a state of serene stillness, her features softened by shadows that suggested both peace and lingering presence. As he studied the plate, Elias felt a strange sensation, an ache not of grief but of recognition. He had carried these memories for so long that they felt like part of his own story. The people he had photographed were gone, yet their faces had lived on through his careful craft. In preserving their memories, he had become part of their legacies. Their stories had shaped him as deeply as he had shaped their final portraits. With a slow, steady breath, he placed the plate back into the trunk. He selected another,
a small child whose photograph had once brought comfort to a family shattered by loss. Elias remembered the mother who had held the image against her heart, believing it carried a piece of her son's spirit. He wondered whether she had lived long enough to share that story with others, or whether the photograph now rested in an attic waiting for the next set of eyes to ponder the echo of sorrow captured in its shadows. He realized that photographs did not simply preserve memories, they outlived them. They carried emotions forward through time, allowing future generations to feel the heaviness or tenderness that once filled a moment. They turned grief into history, sorrow into legacy. And for the dead, whose voices had long since faded, these images remained as whispers in the dark. As Elias continued through his collection, he found himself reflecting on the transformation of his craft. In the early days, photography demanded patience, precision, and resilience. Each exposure was an act of devotion, each plate a fragile treasure. Now, photography had become effortless, instant, vibrant, abundant. Yet despite its evolution, he sensed that something essential had remained. People still sought to hold on to the moments they feared losing. They still yearned to preserve the faces they loved, to freeze time in an image when life felt too fleeting.
The world no longer needed post-mortem photographers, but the echoes of the tradition lingered. In the reflective surface of a smartphone screen, in the soft glow of digitally restored portraits, in the quiet nostalgia of old albums, the essence of remembrance continued. Humanity had not abandoned the impulse to hold on to the past. It had simply found new ways to honor it. As evening settled outside the darkroom, Elias felt the weight of time settle gently upon him. He closed the trunk and rested his hand on its worn surface. The photographs inside were more than relics. They were fragments of lives that had touched his own, shaping him into the person he had become. He felt gratitude for the families who had trusted him, for the quiet rooms that had taught him empathy, and for the images that had allowed him to preserve love long after breath had passed. He extinguished the red lamp, allowing the room to fall into soft darkness. The echoes of memory lingered, but he felt at peace. His work had carried the sorrow of others, yet it had also carried their love, their hope, their fragile humanity. And in the end, that was what remained. Not the shadows, not the silence, not even the grief, but the enduring truth that remembrance is the final gift the living offer to the dead.